very quickly thank you to Hope Recycling Station for organizing this and for inviting me over. So just by way of brief introduction, and maybe Adam has already said some of this in Czech, but I'll just repeat to quickly introduce myself. My name is Anya Harrison. I'm a curator and art critic based in Montpellier, in the south of France, where I'm a curator at Montpellier Contemporain, which is a contemporary art institution which until very recently was directed by Nicolas Bourriaud. So it's an institution which is comprised of three different entities. It's quite an original, different ecosystem that was created a couple of years ago, and it consists of two exhibition venues. One which is a Moko Panese, and which I'll afterwards talk about a couple of exhibitions that I curated or co-curated there over the last year and a half. So that's an institution where we primarily work on solo presentations or thematic group exhibitions with a strong focus on production of new pieces by artists. And the second space, which was opened at the end of June 2019, called Untitled Collection, which is more of a museum space, but I guess the difference with it is that it's a museum space without its own collection. So we're not a collecting institution, and all the exhibitions that we organize there are based on existing collections, whether private or public, from around the world. So a couple of exhibitions that I co-organized there, for example, over the last couple of years. One was called The Non-Conformists, The Story of a Russian Collection, and that was a contemporary collection which is now based in the Tretyakov Gallery, but which originally was in the Tsaritsina Palace, and which was initiated by Andrei Yerofeyev, a Russian art historian, curator, and critic from the 1980s onwards, and was the first public collection of contemporary art by Russian artists from the 1950s onwards. And another exhibition that took place last year, which finished in May, was called The 2000s and was based on works from the Cranford Collection, which is a private collection based in London, which actually collects works from the 1960s through to the present day, but the exhibition was specifically looking at works produced from 2000 to 2010, and trying to, by way of these works, think about how to define and talk about the first decade of the 21st century. So those are the kinds of exhibitions that take place in that venue. And finally, the third entity, which is important for the institution, it's the Fine Art School in Montpellier, the École Supérieure de Beaux-Arts, which is a separate physical space as well, but there's a lot of porosity in terms of how we work with the school, the students there, and including a lot of, trying to include a lot of recent graduates' work as well in some of the exhibitions that we do. Again, I'll talk about that in one of the examples that I'll be discussing. And very briefly, prior to joining MoCo, I'm there from January 2019. I was based in London beforehand, working primarily as a freelance curator and art critic. I co-curated, organized the 13th Baltic Triennial in 2018, which took place across Vilnius, Tallinn, Riga, and also in London. And I also co-organized the Kosovo Pavilion in the last Venice Biennial in 2019 with a solo presentation of work by Albana Muji, which is called Family Album. Right. So I thought I would try and talk about, in the time that I have, three more recent exhibitions that the first two are solo presentations and the last are big group exhibitions, but I think what all of them have in common is trying to present dissonant histories and points of view that bastardize and do not conform to socially accepted norms and patterns of behavior. And they always also include collaborative communal ways of working, which is something very important to me in terms of my curatorial practice. So the first the first shows are ones that took place this summer. It's actually tomorrow is the last day. 2 solo presentations of Marylin Minter and Betty Tompkins, who are 2 American feminist painters, both in their mid-70s. These are actually their first solo presentations in France. For Betty Tompkins, it's her first institutional solo presentation anywhere. So that was a very important moment, and something I'm very proud to work on with over the last year. And the idea behind these 2 shows, which are they are thought of as individual solo presentations, but very much in dialogue with each other, is to put these 2 artists together who, through very different ways, as you will see, both touch on similar questions, which are about representation of sexuality, or the sexual politics of representation, the representation of the female body, and the deconstruction of the male gaze. And the question that really was behind these 2 exhibitions as well was what happens when a woman tackles subject matter and imagery that has historically been the domain of men, and how does it change that? So these initial images are works by Marylin Minter. I should say also that, interestingly, these are 2 artists who have exhibited together in group exhibitions before. They've never been exhibited in solo shows side by side. They've known each other since 1976. Both are based in New York, and know each other in a very anecdotal fashion from their husbands kind of frequenting the same bars at the same time, having met in the loft in which Marylin was moving into and has lived in ever since, but not actually being aware of each other's work until the early 2000s, and not actually being aware that they're both trying to address similar questions, but from very different, with very different techniques and means. So these are also some of Betty Tompkins' images. I'm just going to go back quickly. So with Marylin, I should also say that the shows were not retrospectives, and it was very much a decision from the very beginning not to have a historical overview of her practice, but really focus on kind of the last 10 years of her work, and more recent themes. So with Marylin, the show is primarily focusing on a recent body of work called The Babers, which has been working on since 2016, and which are the main paintings that you can see here, all large format paintings which tend to be called hyper-realist, photorealist, although they're very much not. You can see the kind of, especially when you move closer to them, they start completely falling apart and breaking apart, and there's always this tension between figuration and abstraction in her practice. But the works came out of her interest in looking through art history, and especially a history of painting, and realizing that on the one hand, the trope and the figure of the baver, especially the female baver, is something that traverses the history of art, especially the history of Western art since ancient Greece, probably even before, and which is obviously always tied to a very much male gaze. Voyeurism is always a woman who does not necessarily know or is aware of the fact that she's being observed, and also has absolutely no control of how she's being represented and who afterwards the image is being consumed by. And there are very, at the same time, few examples of women painting other women in art history, of women painting other women at their toilette in art history. So with Marylin, it was very much a decision of questioning, not necessarily trying to construct a female gaze, but asking herself a question, okay, well, what happens when a woman reappropriates the subject matter, and how does that change? And so therefore, this body of work came about, and she decided to transpose it into the 21st century. So what is the baver for the 21st century? It's a woman taking a shower. hence all these images. And and it's always, and with her work, it's always, I mean, she's someone who has a photography practice as well, so there's a very particular technique about it. So the reasoning with the exhibitions was on one hand to put these artists' work and to contextualize them into wider histories of feminism and feminist art practice from the 60s onwards, but to also really consider their position and work as painters and to bring that into the fore, because it's something that quite often tends to get forgotten when we look at these paintings. With these works, I mean, it's very difficult to see, I think, on these slides, and unfortunately it's something that doesn't photograph super well, same with Betty Tompkins. But it's a very long practice. The paintings take about a year to make. It's all enamel paint on metal, which is a technique that she's been using since the 1980s onwards, when she started a solo practice again. And it's a technique that, for her, she says, is the only way that allows her, at the same, on the one hand, to attain a kind of depth in the compositions, but also maintain this level of translucence. And she always starts with a photo shoot. As I said, she's a photographer as well. She starts with a photo shoot. She always works with models who are non-professional models. They're always either friends, people, collaborators, people she knows, people whose look she appreciates and she likes as well. And she shoots them behind frozen panes of glass to try and replicate this image of a steamed up shower window. And she leaves them free to choose their own poses. And after the photo shoot, she puts everything through Photoshop, and she spends about a week creating a composite image, which then becomes the source for the paintings that she completes. So each image already is a kind of idealized, non-realistic image, which is created out of 10, sometimes 20 different photos, sometimes not using the same person as well. And these paintings come through afterwards, which I said, they take about a year. They consist sometimes of about 50 layers of paint. That's applied also there's a very tactical, visceral approach to painting. They're applied with her fingertips, with the palms of her hands, to really smooth on the paint. And the painting is also, can actually evolve drastically as well during the process. So for example, on the slide on the left, the painting that's to the very right, called a Lilith, is one that she was working on for about 3 years, from 2018 to 2021. And in the catalogue that we produced for the exhibition, sort of showing the process of these works, they literally they're two separate works. I saw this work in her studio in January 2020, I think before the whole sort of COVID started. And when I sort of received the final images of this work, I honestly thought it was we were talking about different works. It was something that wasn't on the list that was meant to be happening. So it's something that's always constantly kind of alive and shifting shapes as she's working on it. And this is just actually a piece that we had on the rooftop of a building, because part of the exhibition was also dedicated to her activist work, which was important to present alongside her painting practice, because the formal vocabulary that is often present in her paintings gets transposed often into her activist practice. Someone who works very much with NGOs and charities based in the US, especially Planned Parenthood and Downtown for Democracy. So it goes very much in tandem with everything she does as a painter. And someone who's always been very active in the workforce, defending civic rights and women's rights, and especially rights to abortion, rights to women to control their representation and control their own bodies. And with Betty Tompkins, the dialogue was very much to, again, to provide a different parallel to representation of female body and sexuality. With Marylin, if there's always a kind of sort of glamour and pop sensuality that is part of her work. With Betty, it's very much similar images that she has been working on consistently from the late 1960s. So these works are part of a series called Fuck Paintings, except for one there in the middle, which is part of the Cunt Painting series. And the Fuck Paintings series, which is something that she is probably most well known for, which was started in 1969. The first series dates from 1969 to 1974. And was something that she, part of the reason why she was completely kind of ostracized and sidelined for decades, both from the art world, from institutions and galleries, but also from other feminist and other artists who were trying to defend defending feminist standpoints. I don't know how much all of you are aware or not of the history behind the Fuck Paintings, but it's essentially, she started in 1969 as a young artist, just having moved to New York after her studies. And she started them essentially out of boredom, out of anything else. She was going around galleries at the time looking at what was being exhibited. Of course, all of the shows that were being put on at the time in galleries were mainly male artists. And it's also a time of pop art, minimalism, conceptualism, still abstract expressionism. She's someone who was very much formed in the tradition of abstract expressionism as a painter. And she was effectively just bored by what she was seeing. So one day she started playing around with porn photos that her husband used to collect, and started at first ripping them up with her fingers, reframing them with her fingers using Scotch tape, until basically reframing them to take out any identity markers that could identify a person, so heads, torsos, hands, feet, until she got to the point where all that was visible was the main fulcrum, the act of penetration. And for her, that was, as a composition, something that had force and power and was something that, what she was looking for as a painter. So it was interesting to kind of try and emphasize that in the exhibition as well, of someone who is very much aware of the kind of imagery she is working with, but for whom it is also very important, and who's constantly posing herself very pictorial questions about it. For her, questions to do with tonality, with color, with composition, with framing are just as important as the images that we are faced with straight away. And due to this series, she, and the importance of actually showing her work first in France, was that she was censored in France in 1973. She was invited to participate in a group exhibition on American avant-garde art, realism, photorealism, hyperrealism at the Espace Cardin in Paris, for which she sent 2 of her original Fuck paintings, which were stopped by customs in France at the time. Due to obscenity laws. They weren't allowed to enter France, and it took her over a year to get them back. After which point she tried showing them still to a few people in the US. No one was interested in her work, partially again because of her gender, because of her age, but obviously also because of the imagery she was working with. And she ended up by rolling these paintings away in her studio and not showing them again until 2002. And ironically, she actually participated in the Lyon Biennial in 2003, and the very first Fuck painting that was stopped on the border in 73 joined the permanent collection of the Centre Pompidou in 2004. Kind of the irony. But so that was an important sort of marker as well of having having all of these works being shown in France after decades of invisibility. And as I said, she was ostracized and sidelined by art institutions. She was also ostracized and sidelined by other feminist artists working at the time, because, especially in that point in the US in the late 60s and 70s, before the start of the feminist sex wars in the 1980s and the appearance of more pro-sex movements, and with other practitioners and figures like Annie Sprinkle, for example, it was inconceivable for a woman to be working with this kind of subject matter. And not only to be working with this kind of subject matter, but to be working with it and not criticizing it, not having a critical stance vis-a-vis pornography, which she does not in her work. So this actually composition is a piece from 2019, but in which she reworks the composition from the very first flag painting, and which is also called, the title of it is Flag Painting, Paris 1973, Instagram 2019, which references to the fact that if she's no longer censored by art institutions, she is now more privy to being censored by social media, which has been the case with her on Instagram multiple times, with her account being blocked and being taken down. And these are just a few other series of her work that that are being shown. So drawings, a collage from 1973, which are the only historical works that are in the exhibition, to show the technique of her painting practice as well, which is actually, interestingly, it's a very classical technique. It's in French it's called mise à carreau, and it's the technique of literally just drawing a grid on the original source image and then retranslating that grid onto a large format, which is something that exists from the Renaissance onwards. So it's very much someone who actually works within a very classical sort of tradition. There's obviously references as well to minimalism. And this part of the exhibition, which kind of contextualized everything and was a huge amount of research work, was a large chronological frieze that traversed the whole space of La Panacée. La Panacée is actually, to explain, it's kind of built like a quadrangle. It used to be, back in the 16th, 17th centuries, pharmaceutical school in Montpellier. So this is a very kind of sort of central core part of the building. And it's a historical timeline that traversed the two exhibitions starting from 1969 to 2021. 1969 not being an accidental date, but being relevant to both artists. One, as I said, that's the year that Betty first moved to New York and started the first series of flag paintings. And also the year that Marylin Minter, who was still studying, did a photographic series of works of her mother called Coral Ridge Towers, which when she showed, when she first showed to her professors and fellow students, was deemed so shocking that she subsequently also hid the work and didn't show it for 20+ years. And so with this timeline, the idea was to really situate their work within wider history of feminist practice across the US and across France, and to talk about a wider relationship between art, feminism, pornography, and censorship, not just within visual culture, within culture in a broader sense, but also society and politics, and to draw this panorama, a landscape of feminist struggles, of counter-feminist struggles over the last decades, and to situate the work in this, to an extent showing why the questions that they have been posing and that they are still posing 40 plus years later are still relevant, and why some of the questions that are being discussed more widely in society and culture as to women's control or self-control of bodies are still the same as they were several decades ago. This is just in terms of some of the research that, I mean, at the Barnett Newman, because there's actually a certain amount of humor, especially in Betty's work, in the painting on the left, which is effectively a certain reference to male art being made at the time, in that, with the Barnett Newman zip painting, you can kind of see the parallel, except with Betty, it's being done in much more figurative frontal way. And there's something humorous about this aspect of her work as well, in terms of taking photographs that were being collected by her husband, which, based on the college, they're usually photos for about 5 by 6 centimeters, they're absolutely tiny. And also the fact of them being brought into America in an illegal, kind of invisibilized way, because at the time when she started working on this series, pornography was still illegal in the US, and her husband would order these photographs from the back of magazines. He would have them delivered to a PO box in Vancouver, Canada, and every month or every few weeks he would take the car, drive over the border, pick up the photos, hide them under the seats of the car, and take them back to the US. So there's this whole question of kind of the circulation of images and this fetishization, can't pronounce it, of sex, of porn, that on the one hand is completely illegal, it's not visible, and yet it's circulating everywhere. And for a young female artist to sort of take that and to literally explode that in your face on canvases that are all about 2 meters by 1.5 meters is, I mean, there's a daring, but there's a certain amount of humor in that as well, for me. Sorry, which way am I going? And again, there's kind of parallel that I wanted to draw with, again, the reason for sort of invisibilization for work with Joan Semmel, who's another artist working very much at the same time and who was working on very similar, actually, series, you can see, at the same time, and who also discredited sort of Betty's work, the difference being that with Joan Semmel, the use of color to kind of tone down the hardcore sexual imagery, and also the fact that she very much also positioned herself in a politically correct standpoint, effectively always claiming that she was never working with actually pornographic imagery. All her source imagery was coming from photos that she was taking of her lovers, that she was not actually appropriating existing imagery, which has always been the fact with Betty's work. And as a sideline as well, I mean, Marylin Minter's work, which this is not in the exhibition, but it's these are earlier pieces that she started making in the late 1980s. This was a porn grid from 1989. And again, it's something that when she was working on these works, ended up in her being labeled as a traitor to feminism, effectively, and her work also being taken out from exhibitions. So, yeah. Hold on. Let's see if there's anything else inside this. Oh no. Right. So. And then just to skip backwards a bit, to more sort of thematic show that I co-organized last year, La Panesse, and that was a show that was organized by Vincent Honoré, myself, and Caroline Champron, called Působí. And it's actually a show, I mean, a lot of the thinking behind it was originated by Vincent, like a number of years ago, so I'm not going to claim all of it as my own, but it's something that we were discussing a lot together for about a year and a half. And Působí was a group show that brought together 27 international artists, mainly from a generation born in the 1980s and 1990s onwards, which explored the relationship between resistant or excluded bodies and esotericism. And as a means also to reappropriate and perform feminist, queer, decolonial perspectives. So the subtitle for the exhibition was Déviance, Performance, Résistance, Deviance, Performance, Resistance. And the reasoning behind that was thinking about the occult as something that, in and of itself, is gesture, ritual, that springs forward from bodies that are usually, or have tended to be called deviant, because they do not conform to norms, whether they be religious, social, sexual, racial, medical, and bodies that perform. The cult in and of itself does not have any meaning. It's not visible unless it is performed, whether it's from casting a spell, whether it's from divination, alchemy, making spells, potions, elixirs. So thinking of that, but as a means of resistance as well. Go back a bit on this. So some of the works, to give you just an example of the pieces. At this piece, like we had a couple of pieces by Dominique White, who's a young British artist based in Marseille. And these were actually the very first works that were visible in the exhibition as you came through. And they're large-scale installations, which at the same time remain very, very ephemeral the whole time. Dominique is someone who works on the question of histories of colonialism, and especially the African slave trade. And so she works with recuperated materials that she usually often leaves to be weathered by the elements as well. So here, for example, there's used boat sails. There's, can't see these images, but there's often in her work cowrie shells, which have a strong symbolism because they used to be used as a currency to exchange. Against slaves. And this powder that you see on the floor and around the sculpture, kaolin powder, which is also covers the hands in these photos by Myriam Mindouf, but which has a strong symbolic meaning in a lot of voodoo. Oh my God, what's the word? Not seances, but I'm forgetting my English. Sorry? Dominique, she is Caribbean roots, yeah. Yeah, she's British, but with Caribbean roots. And so a lot of these installations and a lot of her work is thinking about these works as the souls and bodies of African slaves who would often be thrown over during the crossings of the Atlantic because either they were ill, so they were no longer useful for work, or they would be thrown over because they would try and rise up in mutiny against their owners, and they would be thrown over into the waters and drown. And so you think about the re-emergence of these bodies from the depths of the sea. A piece by Philem Collinsem, who's a South African artist, and again, this kind of almost a witch, or sort of a body that is no longer present, but which kind of retains some of its form in these two dresses that are made out of cowhide, but which has been treated so it's almost petrified as well. So there's this almost alchemical process in her work as well, and which is very much present in a lot of other artist practices who were in this exhibition, such as Jean-Marie Apriou, I think I have somewhere. Jean-Marie Apriou, whose snake you can see at the bottom. This installation at the front of the slide by Niels Alix-Tablin, which was created for the exhibition. He's a young French artist who's based in Belgium, who's now based back in France again. And this installation, which this table, anthropomorphic on this table, and set of chairs which make reference to the Sabbath dances and witches' dances, but also with the feet of the chairs making reference to the kind of instruments that were used in the torture of women during the witch hunts. And actually, one thing I will play, that's all. It's because an important part of the exhibition was to think of possession not only in just the kind of works that were presented, but how they inhabited the space. So we worked very much with a light designer, but also architects, to change the parcours of the exhibition spaces, closing off certain corridors, closing off certain rooms to change like how the public who might also know the panacée actually traverse it, and having it inhabited by sound as well. So
I'm trying to be born above the ocean. I leave the seeds and the cells to escape my own egg. I'm trying to be born under the ocean. The wind and the waves makes me dance.
So all of the sound is from works that were presented in the exhibition as
I'm
well.
trying to be born in another formula. Daughter of the sun, daughter of the storm. I'm trying to be born in hydrogen form, like a piece of the air, like the oxygen air. I'm trying to be born under the ocean. I make the stars and the sea. I build eternity.
So for a second, the song that you heard for a minute, more in the background, and which was emanating actually from all of these radios that were positioned in the middle of the space. So it's work by Ian Forsyth and Jane Pollard, which is from 2014 actually. So it wasn't a new work, but it was a new production for the exhibition and how it was presented. So the piece is called Requiem for 114 Radios. And it was literally 114 analog radios that were presented in the space. The song is Dies Irae, which is a Catholic requiem dating from the Renaissance, but which most famously, for most people, is associated with The Shining by Stanley Kubrick. And each radio is programmed so that there's one voice coming from it, coming through it. The song consists of 14 different voices. So Ian and Jane, I mean, they have a practice that actually works across a lot of music as well. So they invited different musicians and singers, people like Jarvis Cocker, probably the most well-known one from the pulp, to provide vocals for the song. And so each radio, as you traverse the space, you can individually hear each of the voices in and of itself as you walk through it. At the same time, with distance, it becomes a polyphony at a choir, different voices, and that was a way of thinking about the exhibition as well, to really avoid any single authoritative, authorial perspective, and to have this dissonance of voices everywhere.
I'm trying to be born between space and heavy seas. I live under the skins. I belong all around. I'm trying to be born under the ocean. I leave the seeds and the cells to escape my own egg.
Very quickly, I just wanted to show a couple of images from the publication that we made to accompany the exhibition. As the two really went hand in hand, and it was a similar process of thinking about how to transcribe some of the thinking and the approach to presenting these works in a physical space, to presenting them on a page. So again, we worked with a duo of graphic designers based in Dijon called Atelier Tout Va Bien to conceive a publication. So throughout it, we had this constant dégradé of color bleeding in and out across all the pages. And we invited, alongside ourselves, about 15 other critics and curators to each write a text about each one of the artists or collectives presented in the exhibition, to have each time very different critical perspective, standpoint on each of the practices, and to basically avoid this singular voice. It's something that actually we used as well for the catalog for the Baltic Triennial as well. And to have each time a plethora of different perspectives coming through, and similarly the way of presenting the images in the catalog, of kind of almost having as a cinematic scroll, because one thing that we're very much inspired in the exhibition by, and maybe you can sort of see in some of the colors used, was looking at a lot of horror films as well during our research, and especially Dario Argento's Suspiria, that provided a strong sort of color element. I'll very quickly just talk about a Baltic Triennial as well, but just run through it. But it's an important project because it kind of, a lot of thinking behind působí also was something that we worked for during the Baltic Triennial. So as I said, it took place in 2018. It actually started in 2017 with a prelude, but it was the first time that the Triennial was presented across the three Baltic countries. So we actually started with an evening of performances at the South London Gallery in London to launch the Triennial, and then it was subsequently followed by an exhibition at the CAC in Vilnius, at the Tallinn Art Hall, and at Kim in Riga. And each time the idea was very much that it was not the same exhibition that was being reproduced across all the different spaces, but that it was very much 3 different chapters dealing with different aspects of the notion of belonging. So the exhibition was called Give Up for Ghost, and it was conceived at the time when everything kind of politically and socially that we sort of took for granted and as stable was slowly starting to really fall apart in Flanders. So really starting from things like Brexit in the UK, the election of Trump in the US, and the increasing rise of sort of nationalist, populist parties and politics across sort of much of Europe. Really made us question the notion. Okay, what does it mean to belong in a time of fractured identities and sensibilities? So each part of this chapter, over 70 artists in total presented, artists and poets and musicians, and dealt with different aspects of this. So in Thailand, it was kind of thinking about origins, myths, nature, ecology. In Thailand, it was very much to do with the body and all its different concepts of the like disembodied body, fractured body, broken body, the disabled body. And in Riga, it was thinking about the notion of community, and a large part of the space was given over to Ben Burgess and Ksenia Pedin, a duo of artists from London, who created this whole immersive installation and kind of the majority of Kim, with a small space, which is on the right-hand slide, which was dedicated to what we called the memory room, and trying to, as it was the last chapter of a triennial, trying to think about, okay, how to create potentially like a ghost of a retrospective of a triennial in a space that was about maybe 20 meters squared. And so throughout the whole of 2-3 months that it was on, every 2 weeks, the presentation in that space would change, and we invited each one of the artists and practitioners to suggest works, whether they were elements from the pieces that they had presented earlier in the triennial or from across the wider practice, that could stand in for their physical absence, and to have this kind of rolling memory of everything that had traversed the other chapters over the last months. Voilà. I think I will probably stop there because.
Thank you.
Thank you.